אנחנו נפתח כרגע במושב הראשון בהשתתפות פרופסור הינשלווד, גברת אליס בורס, ובהנחייתה של דוקטור רוני קרמלי. שיהיה לנו יום מוצלח ומעניין. רוני, בבקשה.
תודה מיכל. ברשותכם אני אעבור כרגע לאנגלית. It is most exciting for me to introduce once again Professor Bob Hinshelwood for the sake of those who missed yesterday's excellent session. Professor Hinshelwood is a psychiatrist and one of the most prominent post-Kleinian psychoanalysts today. He has published many books and papers. His book about Bion's clinical work, I see, has been published already, right, recently, in Routledge. We will now hear his paper, Intuition, the Third Ear.
Yes. I'm not very good with microphones, I'm afraid. Okay, if you can't hear, do put your hand up and I'll shout at the microphone. All right. You have the text on the screen, is that right? No.
We have it in Hebrew.
Ah, yes, yes. It is on the screen, is it? All right. No. So today I will continue with some more detail about the ideas and particularly this double kind of communication which goes on between different minds, between separate minds. So this lecture will be mostly about Bion and his influence. But again, I'll start with a quote from Freud. The analyst, Freud says, must turn his own unconscious like a receptive organ towards the transmitting unconscious of the patient. He must adjust himself to the patient as a telephone receiver is adjusted to the transmitting microphone. Well, I guess we have a similar issue with this microphone. But let me know if you can hear all right, either with the paper or with the discussion afterwards. Freud was aware that we must be very careful about how we listen to our patients. His interest, when he started psychoanalysis, had been in the communication from the unconscious to the conscious mind, well, particularly in dreams. But he then recognized the importance of the communication between patient and analyst. The failure of his listening to his patient Dora in 1899 led him to a lot of rethinking, and that he had to give importance to the negative transference. But he wondered how he had conveyed something to Dora that warned her against him. Well, in thinking about this, on one occasion, Freud was persuaded by Ferenczi to go to a spiritualist séance to try to observe the non-verbal communication which might be around the séance table. He did not learn anything from a séance, and I don't think he really solved the problem he was trying to investigate. Perhaps he didn't have the right question to ask. Well, a century later, we are much clearer how transference and countertransference is communicated. It seems to be a parallel communication next to the conscious free associations in words. Well, early in Bion's career, when he was a medical student, actually, he encountered his inspiring teacher, Wilfrid Trotter, and I quoted yesterday from Bion that Trotter regarded the patient as the true fount of knowledge. It implied that there is some faculty of listening that requires a special concentration. It seems more than a computer recognition of the semantic meaning of the words being used. There is semantic content, but there is something added. Well, before Bion was a psychoanalyst, and he qualified in 1950, before he was a psychoanalyst and during his training, he studied and wrote about the groups he was investigating in the 1940s. And he concluded, I do not feel quite as happy about postulating a transference situation as I do about postulating a countertransference. There is here an implication that listening to someone talk requires at the same time a listening to one's own response inside oneself. In fact, he had been following this kind of practice in his experimental work in military psychiatry during the war, and then back at the Tavistock Clinic after the war. Well, Bion had started an analysis in 1939 with the aim of training as a psychoanalyst. He was in analysis with John Rickman, a senior member of the British Psychoanalytical Society. But this analysis rapidly came to an end when the war started in 1939. However, they remained in contact, Bion and Rickman, and they developed ideas together that Rickman had originally recognized in Kurt Lewen's social field theory, which in my view was quite a powerful influence in British psychiatry, though is not well known. Rickman considered the analytic session as a social field of two people, and he wrote in a paper that was unpublished at the time, and this is quite a long quote from Rickman. Now, this brings me to the question, by what means do the psychoanalysts gain an insight into another person's unconscious mental processes? The situation in which analyst and patient find themselves is a social relationship. There is no attempt to restrict the interplay of these two people in any direction. It does not have to be friendly or severe, one of teacher and taught, superior and inferior. It has to be whatever the patient wants it to be. But there is one proviso. The reason for the relationship must be realized consciously and by interpretation. There is a close analogy here with ordinary social tact, he says. We must realize the part we are expected to play in any social relationship in which we find ourselves. Whether we accept the role or not is another matter. And the second requirement is that he, the analyst, must find out how the situation has arisen in the patient's mind. Well, Rickman was emphasizing how the analyst must find out how the situation between analyst and analysand came about. This is not so distant from the view of relational psychoanalysis, as I understand it today, but it does have a particular Kleinian perspective. they did not see the relationship as a joint relationship, this is the relational people as I understand it, but as a creation of the patient who somehow managed to draw the analyst into playing a part. I'm sorry, Kleinians did not see the analytic relationship as a joint relationship, but as a creation of the patient who somehow managed to draw the analyst into playing a part. Rickman wrote confidently, but we know that how the patient draws the analyst in is very complex and actually largely unconscious. It makes Rickman one of the earlier people to focus on countertransference, actually in the late 1930s. Bion followed that direction, and one can see in his work in the wartime and afterwards at the Tavistock Clinic that he paid special attention to the role that he, the group therapist, found he was pushed into in the group. He conceptualized this as the result of multiple social forces or vectors in the social field. The importance of self-examination is to discover one's role, unconscious as well as conscious. And this became the focus of Bion's method in both groups and in psychoanalysis. However, the interesting point for our discussion is how one becomes aware of the role one is playing. The whole narrative of the roles which the analyst complies with unconsciously is what we call today an enactment. What are the social forces acting in this little group of two? And especially, how do we pick them up? They are not defined and encouraged by the use of language and words. They seem to be invisible and inaudible, unconscious forces. This method of how psychoanalysts gain an insight into another person's unconscious processes clearly fits Bion's interest in this special process of listening. The central point is that, firstly, the analyst pays attention to the role he is placed in by the patient. Then we can understand the other roles that group members or analysans are adopting for themselves. And we'll follow Bion's own development of thought about this. Incidentally, Bion's paper just mentioned in 1948, where he talked about preferring countertransference to transference, that was in 1948, the year before Paula Hyman presented her now classic paper on countertransference to the IPA in 1949, and it was published in 1950. And you may know that Paula Hyman was one of Bion's training supervisors at that precise time. And indeed, Paula Hyman's own analyst in Berlin, where she originally trained, was Theodor Reich, and he published a book the year before, in 1948, and in English, called Listening with the Third Ear. So I'm trying to convey that around the time, at the end of the 1940s, there was a lot of interest in this kind of second form of communication, the third ear, as Theodor Reich called it. Now, Bion had started a second analysis with Melanie Klein immediately after the war in 1945. He qualified as a psychoanalyst in 1950 and then continued his analysis with Melanie Klein until 1953. From then, he joined a group of Kleinian analysts working with patients who were in psychotic states. using Klein's ideas on splitting and the primitive defenses which Klein had described in her 1946 paper, Notes on Schizoid Mechanisms. And she had described a deeper layer of the unconscious. She was always talking about a deeper layer, deeper than Freud's layer, a deeper layer of the unconscious with these primitive anxieties and specific defenses she had learned from Carl Abraham, who was her analyst in Berlin. One of the most important aspects of her 1946 paper was the role she gave to splitting of the ego. And Klein added to this the specific defense of projective identification. For Klein, initially, this was a form of mental evacuation of parts of the self and of ego functions that had been split off from the self. Freud had described splitting of the ego in a couple of late papers, one of them in 1927 on fetishism, and one published after he died, an incompleted paper called Splitting of the Ego. And this had been developed further by Fairbairn in 1941 and other British psychoanalysts at the time. The functions that are commonly split off are those involved in the reality principle, which Freud had listed in his paper in 1911. Their loss disables the perception of reality if and when it becomes intolerable. After the ego is split, then some parts may be projected out of the self altogether. Termed projective identification, it is essentially an unconscious experience of evacuating and disposing of fragmented parts of the self. It explains the loss of identity in psychosis as well as the loss of reality. But Bion, with his interest in the parallel form of communication, explored projective identification as the means of communication. He postulated that with less extreme forms of splitting than in psychotic states, projective identification could be just a parallel form of communication in people who are not psychotically disturbed. It is clear, for instance, that a newborn baby communicates normally with mother without the use of words. And Bion, in a presentation in 1957, is published in 1959, described this. He wrote of the analytic situation with an adult patient. When the patient strove to rid himself of fears of death, which were felt to be too powerful for his personality to contain, he split off his fears and put them into me. The idea apparently being that if they were allowed to repose there, inside the analyst, long enough, they would undergo modification by my psyche and could then be safely reintrojected. And he immediately related this to an extremely early scene in infancy. The analytic situation, he says, built up in my mind a sense of witnessing an extremely early scene. The mother should have treated the infant's cry as more than a demand for her presence. From the infant's point of view, she should have taken into her and thus experienced the fear that the child was dying. It was this fear that the child could not contain. He strove to split it off together with the part of the personality in which it lay and project into the mother. So an understanding mother is able to experience the feeling of dread that this baby was striving to deal with by projective identification and yet retain a balanced outlook. This indicates a communicative process at a pre-verbal level, which he claimed is replayed in a psychoanalysis even with adults. Even then, in babies and adult patients, the primitive mechanisms of splitting of the ego and projective identification into others takes place. This is the process of containing, and it is now understood to be a frequent and ubiquitous occurrence in human communication. It is not clearly recognized, though. Psychologists have researched their related conception of non-verbal communication since the 1950s. But Bion and others studied the use of these primitive defenses, including projective identification. Sometimes they are beneficial in the process of containing in infancy and in adulthood, but sometimes they go wrong, leading to psychotic states. And later his colleague, Hannah Siegel, commented succinctly, "A great deal can go wrong in the projection of seeking a container. The relation between the container and contained may be felt as mutually destructive or mutually emptying, as well as being mutually creative." But Bion moved on from these investigations of psychotic states and mechanisms, and in the 60s he was deeply involved in formulating an epistemology of psychoanalysis. That is the question, how do we know that psychoanalysis is knowledge? But knowing things in psychoanalysis brought him back to attempting to understand the unconscious form of communication that's beyond words. We know it in English in the phrase, "in our guts." Well, by 1970, Bion had distinguished the two forms of communication. And I'll quote him here because I think it's quite vivid. "The point that demonstrates the divergence most clearly is that the physician is dependent," that's the doctor interested in the body of a patient, a general doctor, "the physician is dependent on realization of sensuous experience, in contrast with the psychoanalyst, whose dependence is on experience that is not sensuous." Now, what does he mean by that? He says, the physician can see and touch and smell. The realizations with which a psychoanalyst deals cannot be seen or touched. Anxiety has no shape or color, smell or sound. For convenience, he said, I propose to use the term intuit as a parallel in the psychoanalyst's domain to the physician's use of see, touch, smell, and hear. So he prioritized this intuitive, empathic kind of communication that is not represented by features of reality. You see, if a friend comes to me and says that their wife has died, I will see the expression on his face. I will understand the semantic meaning of a death. But in addition, I am likely to have a deep sense of his loss. I empathize, I know his bereavement in a different way and feel personally something of his grief in myself. At times, Bion called this empathic process evocation. He also called it becoming the other's state of mind, or of being it. For our purposes, the theory of containing raises a crucial issue, the difference between the communication a patient makes in his verbal free associations on one hand, and the experience we have of containing his feelings in the transference and countertransference. I have traced in Bion's development his interest in an empathic intuition. But psychoanalysis started very differently. It started with an intellectual understanding of the representations in dreams of unconscious experiences. Okay, thanks. The human mind has the capacity to use one thing to represent another thing. We have a highly functional as-if capacity that is hardly known in animals. As Freud wrote in describing the reality principle, motor discharge, which, under the dominance of the pleasure principle, had served as a means of unburdening the mental apparatus of accretions of stimuli, was now employed in the appropriate alteration of reality. Restraint upon motor discharge was provided by means of the process of thinking. It is essentially an experimental kind of acting. So thinking is an experimental kind of action inside the mind. This is a excuse me. This is a major departure from the ordinary biological response to a stimulus. For animals, if they feel hungry, they go and look for food. Humans can think ahead experimentally to plant seeds and harvest the produce for when they will feel hungry in the future. There is, in the mind, a representation of the stimulus and the possible or non-actual satisfaction. For Freud, the experiences we have in our minds become the representations of our experience. But Freud did not pursue this further, but we can see that the human animal can do more than represent things in his own mind in this form of experimental action. He can communicate the representations in his mind to become a representation in another person's mind. We have language, but also other modes of communicating our representations. Perhaps this then makes us social animals instead of just herd animals. This use of the analyst's mind by the patient has been an inspiration for countless analysts ever since. It means we can communicate about the experiments in our minds, and from that develops our very considerable collaborative achievements, as well as the creation of the cultures of groups or societies or nations. So representations are not actually what they represent. They have a general symbolic form. Yet they can have a kind of truth. The word for tree is not actually a tree. It's a sound carried in the air. but we know the word means the thing in our minds that we call a tree. And it means a tree in the mind of someone we speak the word to. We suspend the strict reality principle. There's the English poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge once described this capacity a long time ago, to allow something to be what it is not, but to be something else. It is an as-if quality, as our minds allow that willing suspension of disbelief. And this goes back, as I indicate, to 1817, more than 200 years. Thus, representation has ambiguities. In 1929, René Magritte painted a tobacco pipe. He called it, the picture, La trahison des images, the treachery of images. And part of the writing on the picture is a part of the picture. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. He meant that the picture is not a pipe. Is he right? Of course he is right. It is a construction of a canvas, oil paints, wood, varnish, etc. And yet someone coming up to the picture on the wall will say, oh, it's a pipe. At the time, back in 1929, it may have been disturbing because he said, and I'll quote from an interview with Marguerite, how people reproached me for it. And yet, could you stuff my pipe? No, it's just a representation, is it not? So if I had written on my picture, this is a pipe, I'd have been lying. Well, was it a lie, actually? The thing is, we can misrepresent to ourselves, as in dreams, and we can misrepresent to others. As being observed, it is too often forgotten that the gift of speech, so centrally employed, has been elaborated as much for the purpose of concealing thought by dissimulation and lying, as for the purpose of elucidating or communicating thought. Is Magritte's image a lie? Probably it is not, but it expresses an ambiguity about representations. In a patient's free associations, we have to question whether they are conveying a genuine experience or are they covering something up. If someone breaks a favorite ornament of theirs and says, oh, it doesn't matter, we will know that they are trying to minimize their level of disappointment and loss by misrepresenting their state of mind. But unconscious deceptions are much harder to recognize. And Freud devised his method of dream analysis to extract the truer meaning of a dream. And then he elaborated his complex metapsychology to give signposts to the more likely unconscious meanings of representations, mostly derived from the Oedipus complex. And others have added to Freud over the last 125 years. Returning to some of Bion's wide-ranging thinking in his epistemological work, he was interested in the mathematical theory of transformations. He wrote the book he called Transformations in 1965. If you look at some particular thing from two different angles, that very same thing appears different. It is transformed. An obvious example, which he mentions, is that a circle on a piece of paper looked at from an angle appears as an ellipse. These are different shapes, but the thing that is seen is just the same. The image transforms when moving from one perspective to another. It is also the case that an ellipse drawn on a piece of paper can be seen from a particular angle as a circle. The thing that is constant from different angles is called the invariant in mathematics. It does not vary, even though it appears different from different angles. And Bion adopted the term invariant for a while and seemed to think that colleagues from different schools of psychoanalysis could see their observations in different ways according to their theoretical point of view. It is not possible to represent a singular truth from one perspective. Bion had understood that when we see something in reality, a realization, it is not seen as it actually is. If we look at the lawn in the garden, it has a color, green. But the color is really a wavelength of light. But our brain-mind apparatus processes the sensation in a prescribed way. And Bion described this process in his own way and with his own terminology. The immediate perception from the sense organs is processed according to a set of expectations. It mates, he said, with a preconception, a sort of template, to create a meaningful experience he called a conception. The raw perception is not meaningful, and he called it a beta element. The process by which it interacts with the template or preconception, Bion called alpha function, and the result, the mentally useful and meaningful experience, he called an alpha element. We therefore live in a mental world of these meaningful elements which are constructed in our minds, and our main way of seeing truth is by making meaning, that is, alpha function. However, that meaning making is achieved against the backdrop of an existing template of meanings, the preconceptions. People with different preconceptions in mind, like analysts with different metapsychologies, will see the same thing from slightly different angles. So tracking down the truth behind the representation is not easy. And I refer again to Betty Joseph, who said, I am suggesting that if we listen to our patients, first of all, from the angle of the object relationship that is alive at the moment, this will enable us to see better the nature of the patient's conflicts and method of maintaining psychic balance. Joseph's advice was that there is a sense of a live emotional connection, and this can guide us with the actual material. In other words, one way to check the validity of the patient's representations in the material is to assess the experience of where we are in the transference-countertransference relationship. At the moment, the material emerges. What roles are we given in relation to our patient? And she gave an illustration we discussed yesterday, this dual form of gaining a valid understanding of the patient's state of mind. And then she gives us another clinical moment with a rather narcissistic, omnipotent man in his 40s. He had attended a general lecture given by a well-known analyst. In the session, the patient criticized the speaker strongly, not so much for the content of the lecture, but for his personality, how he handled the discussion, what kind of person he really was, etc. He assumed correctly that I would know this man. He talked on, and I had the clear impression, the longer he talked, that the more he was expecting me to respond to what he was saying, as if I did not like or agree with his viewpoint, as if he expected me to be caught up in a kind of argument with him. So she's describing her sense of a role that the patient was attempting to create in a little drama in the session as it's happening. So looking at this, her description, from the point of view of the content of the material represented in his words, she says, we could see it as an attack on an older man, suggesting that the patient was making a split between myself and the lecturer, the latter perhaps in the role of his father. On one level, this might well be true and contain elements of classical Oedipal rivalry. So, as Joseph conveys, this is a reasonable psychoanalytic interpretation. But Joseph hesitated, and she says, but the method that will take us into the heart of the patient's immediate conflicts is to start from my awareness, she says, of what was being acted out with me, where I was unconsciously being pushed into having a difference of opinion or a row with my patient. So this assessment of the role of the analyst does converge with the experience the patient suggested in his material. So Joseph felt the Oedipal interpretation was limited and maybe mechanical and theoretical. And she briefly gives her interpretation. He expected me to ally myself with this lecturer, Dr. X, take offense at what he, my patient, was saying, and somehow reveal my disturbance, that is, the analyst's disturbance. The patient, she thought, was more intent on provoking the analyst at that moment to show her allegiance, the analyst's allegiance, and to defend the lecturer's personality. Her own personality might be defective, like the lecturer's. So the point that Joseph was making is that the interpretation needs to touch not just the meaning of the material, but should touch the moment in the session. She goes on that the patient was silent for a moment. Was he thinking about her interpretation? And she says, he went on to tell me about a piece of work that he himself had just done and how well people had spoken about it and praised him. Now, Joseph thought this was a significant response. The patient did not respond to the piece of work the analyst had just done. The patient talked of his own piece of work, as if he had taken over hers and was possessing it as if it were his own, gained by his omnipotence. There is here, actually in the session, a problem displayed by this omnipotent man right now about who does the best work. He was not taking in the analyst's work as hers and appreciating it as potentially something useful he could think about. Indeed, his not taking it, she noted, went along with one of his symptoms. She says, this man has a history of anorexia. Well, whatever the correctness of an Oedipal problem, The communication was in the moment with the analyst, with her, and the work she did. The communication was not a representation in his words. As she remarked in the paper, this was a primitive level of an oral problem of nourishment, from a nourishing breast. But from the present point of view, the two forms of communication have been carefully dissected by Joseph. The material about the lecturer who he criticized was represented in words. The intention to provoke a disagreement with his analyst was not represented, but more directly felt. And this non-representational mode of communication was a direct impact on the emotions of the analyst. It's a direct impact on the person of the analyst. So, just in conclusion, I've tried to suggest that the analyst's job of finding the truth in the material is extremely difficult. In fact, as I say, one can wonder why we want to do the job at all. It's so difficult. Our interpretations vary. They vary from one school of psychoanalysis to another, and they vary according to whether they tally with something in the patient or are simply incorrect. That which is represented is seen from a perspective and can be misrepresented. But Bion was interested in non-represented mental entities, seen directly through an empathic identification. It is not represented through a conventional set of symbols. This implies it may not necessarily be distorted, and it could be known directly as a particular mental state. It means that these empathic intuitions are not distorted by the usual coordinates of time and space, although they could be distorted by the mental coordinates of anxiety and defense. Thank you very much.